In this clip, we're going to learn about the pivot point and the anchor points of a UI element. The pivot point is represented by this ring in the center of your UI element. You can move this pivot point by simply left-clicking and dragging it to any point on your canvas. Now you can drag it to any corner, but you also have the ability to place it really anywhere that you like. You can even place it outside of the UI element. Now, the pivot point is going to control where an object scales to and how it rotates. So, for example, if I were to bring this back to the center, and you'll notice these marks that we get whenever we get to the center, we can come in and we can begin to rotate this element. Now, to rotate the element, I have to go out of blueprint mode. And blueprint mode, basically, it allows me to edit the transform as if it was not rotated or scaled. And it also enables snapping, as you can see by the tooltip here. With this turned off, you'll notice that if I hover over the corner, I get this rotation symbol or icon. And I can begin to rotate this object, as you can see here. And this is basing itself off of the pivot point. Now, if I were to change this, let's say that I brought it up here, and then began to rotate, you'll notice that it rotates around that point now. Let's hit Control-Z a couple of times to bring that back. Now, we also have the ability to scale to the pivot point. So if I were to bring it to the bottom left, and then I began to scale, let's say, well, let's go ahead and scale, let's say, to from this side. Now, if I were to drag from this corner, it's automatically going to scale from the opposite corner that you've grabbed. So to show this successfully, we need to hold down Shift and then start to drag, and then hold down Alt, and that will drag on the pivot point itself. Let's do this again from this side, however. So begin to drag, hold down Shift, and then Alt, and you'll notice that it starts to scale. Now, the problem is that it snapped down to 0, and we've lost our local position. So let's hit Control-Z. Let's try it from this corner. Hold Shift and Alt, and you'll see that it's still basing itself off of that pivot point. Let's go ahead and move it somewhere off to this side. And let's grab that pivot point. There we go. And then I'm going to start to drag this around. Now hold down Shift and then Alt, and you'll see it's now scaling to that pivot point. Let's hit Control-Z a few times to get it back to that original position that we had. Let's go ahead and switch the pivot point back to the center. Now you also have the ability to type in the pivot point. So you can type in 0.5 and 0.5. It's worth noting that the pivot point values that you type in are actually percentages. So at 0.5, it is actually at the center of the object in relation to its size. Now you'll notice that as I typed that in, it did modify the top and bottom values here. So let's actually just drag this back down to the bottom here, and we'll be back at the top where it's at 205. So that's the pivot point. We understand that it modifies how an object scales and also how it rotates. Now, looking at this, it's also going to modify the overall value that you type in here. So let's say that I take the pivot point and move this to here. You'll notice that the top is still at 205. Okay, but let's say that I take it down. So now that we've talked about the pivot point, let's talk about the anchor points. The anchor points are denoted by these 4 triangles. It's important to note that the anchor points cannot go outside of the bounds of the canvas or the parented object. In this case, this is our panel, and the canvas, as you can see here, is represented by this object. So the panel itself can stretch all the way out, and as it sits right now, this UI element will stretch with the canvas. So to see this in action, we can actually grab the inspector and begin to modify the shape of this. Let's go to our game view, and then let's adjust this, and you'll see that it's stretching based on the pixels or the resolution of the screen itself. So it's stretching horizontally and vertically. So let's start to change the anchor points and see how this modifies things. So instead of allowing it to scale across the entire screen. Perhaps we want this to stay the exact same size. I'm going to modify the overall size of this element just so we can see this a little bit easier. So something like this, if I were to go to my game view and then modify the size of my screen, you'll notice that it is still scaling as we saw before. But let's say that I take the anchor points and I snap them to the outside edges here. Let's go ahead and turn that blueprint mode on so that way we can snap these anchor points. And it looks like, there we go, now it's snapping there. So here, what this is going to do is it is still going to scale this, but it's going to scale it and try to keep the overall proportions of this object. So let's go to the game mode, and you'll see that it's keeping the scale of that panel and still scaling the canvas. Now, if I were to take the anchor points and I centered them, meaning bringing them all together to one point, what it will do is it will keep the object at the exact same size and then keep it positioned at this point. So if I were to modify this, you'll see that it's staying the exact same size as far as pixels go, and then the screen is getting too small to keep that UI element in place or to keep it the same size. So you can see that that's how we can possibly use maybe an image or something like that. Now, it's worth noting that whenever we modify these anchor points and these pivot points, we can always get back to an original kind of state by going to the anchor presets, and we can modify things like the anchor points themselves. So I could set the anchor points to the top like this. I could have them go to the top, but then maybe even to the top left, or perhaps the top right. And as you can see here, we're clicking top. Let's do middle, and we're at middle right, or at the center, and this is the center of the canvas. Now on this, we could also tell it to stretch. So we could have it stretch in vertically, and you'll see how it splits those apart. But then what if we wanted to stretch horizontally as well? We could come over and say stretch horizontally. Now you can control it across the top here and do 2 clicks, or you can modify it by using these icons in the middle. So these particular presets that we have here, these are going to change things in 2 directions. So the anchor point is going to be at the top left, the top middle, the top right. Okay? And you can experiment with those and see exactly how it changes the anchor points. These in the middle are going to always bring the anchor points together, but then collect them at one point that you've chosen. Now when we start to stretch, let's say that we do stretch horizontally, as you can see there, the anchor points are still coming together at the 2 corners. Stretch them out, and there you go. You also have the ability to set the position and the pivot of the object by using keyboard shortcuts. So if I held down Shift, this is going to allow me to set the pivot point of the object along with setting the anchor points. So here I'm going to set the anchor point to the top left, but then the pivot point is going to be to the top left of the element. We could set it here, here, and there you go. And then we have the ability to also do stretch and then modify the pivot point of the object. Okay, center and center, and then stretch all the way across. Now if we held down Alt, we can also set the position of the element itself. And as you can see, the element is represented by the small box in this. So if I can do bottom left, middle there we go. And this is also modifying the anchor point. Now if you hold down Alt and Shift, you're modifying the anchor point, the position of the object, and the pivot point. So we can center everything on the canvas just like this. We could set everything to where it stretches and it goes full screen with the canvas. So go ahead and play around with some of those anchor presets just to get a feel for them. So now that we understand what the pivot point does and how these anchors work, let's go ahead and get our hands dirty and really start to fully understand how they work. And we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to create just kind of a mock-up of a dialog box.